She inherited a dilapidated house from her grandmother in the middle of nowhere and wanted to cry. But as soon as she opened the door, everything changed. Watch until the end and write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe. The funeral was small but dignified. Gray skies hung heavy over the cemetery in northwest Atlanta, and a thin drizzle moistened the black coats and umbrella tops of the mourners standing in silence. Nia Jackson stood slightly apart, her gloved hands folded tightly in front of her as the preacher spoke. She felt like a guest in her own family. Her grandmother, Evelyn, had been the matriarch, the pillar, the healer, the keeper of stories, and now, with her gone, everything felt shakier, like the whole lineage might collapse under the weight of absence. Beside the polished casket, her older brother Marcus delivered a heartfelt eulogy, his deep, confident voice steady, even in sorrow. He always knew how to hold a room, how to make his presence known. He spoke of Evelyn's life as a nurse during the civil rights era, of her strength, her sacrifice, her kindness. But his words, as eloquent as they were, felt rehearsed to Nia. He had barely visited Evelyn in her final months. Meanwhile, Nia had made weekly trips across the city to bring groceries, rub lotion into the old woman's frail hands, and read aloud from dusty books Evelyn kept near her bedside. When it was Nia's turn to speak, she passed. Her voice, she feared, would betray the storm inside her, a strange mix of grief, confusion, and something she wasn't ready to name. Instead, she remained silent, staring at the casket as the rain began to fall more steadily, soaking through the thin soles of her shoes. 2 days later, Nia sat in a small legal office with peeling wallpaper and a flickering fluorescent light overhead. The lawyer, a thin white man with a sharp nose and sharper cheekbones, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Beside her, Marcus leaned back in his chair, legs spread comfortably apart, his arms folded, a calm smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The air was still, like the moment before a summer storm. Nia kept her eyes on the folder in the lawyer's hands. She had no expectations. Marcus had always been the favorite. He was the successful one, the one Evelyn praised to everyone who would listen. Nia was the quiet one, the one who taught 5th grade in a run-down public school, who lived in a one-bedroom rental with a leaky sink and a stack of unpaid bills. The lawyer opened the file and began reading in a tone so flat it felt mechanical. According to the last will and testament of Evelyn Lucille Jackson, dated August 3, 2022, he went on, detailing minor bequests, heirloom jewelry to a cousin, a cherished quilt to a church friend. Then came the big one. To my beloved grandson, Marcus Isaiah Jackson, I leave the property located at 417 North Peachtree Avenue, including all its furnishings, fixtures, and attached structures. Marcus's smirk widened into a grin. "Well, all right," he murmured, not even trying to contain his satisfaction. Nia glanced at him but said nothing. "And to my granddaughter, Nia Michelle Jackson," the lawyer continued, his tone unchanging, "I leave the house and land located in the unincorporated township of Harperville, Georgia, including any and all outbuildings, records, and associated property." There was a pause. Marcus turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Harperville?" he said, like the word tasted sour. Nia stared at the lawyer. She didn't know what to say. Harperville, a name from childhood, a place that existed only in hazy memories, hot summers, buzzing cicadas, the smell of sweet grass. She hadn't been there since she was 7 or 8. Her grandmother had rarely spoken of it. That's it?" she asked. The lawyer nodded. "Those are the primary assets. The will is clear." Marcus leaned closer. Guess you get the spooky shack in the middle of nowhere, he said with a chuckle. Hope you like raccoons and rot. The lawyer handed her a manila envelope. Inside were keys, a printed map, and the legal documents transferring ownership. Nia took them with a numb hand. Her stomach turned. Marcus stood up and stretched. Well, this has been real. Thanks, Mr. Bryant. He turned to Nia as he slung on his coat. Try not to let the weeds swallow you alive out there. I'm sure Grandma meant well. Sort of. He walked out with a smug chuckle echoing behind him. Nia remained seated for a long moment after he left, staring at the keys. They felt cold, even through her gloves. That night, she returned to the small apartment she shared with peeling paint and buzzing pipes. A pink envelope stuck out from under the door. A notice of termination from the school district. Budget cuts. Her contract would not be renewed next semester. Inside, the refrigerator hummed loudly. She sank onto the old futon in the corner and let the envelope with the keys slide onto the floor. The heater clicked off. The silence stretched. She hadn't just lost her grandmother. She had lost her job, her last anchor. And now, her brother, the only family she had regular contact with, treated her inheritance like a joke. Over the next few days, the apartment grew darker, colder. Her utilities were past due. Calls went unanswered. A cousin sent a text that read, "Heard about the will. Sorry, girl. Grandma always had her reasons." Nia didn't reply. She didn't have the energy to explain that she didn't care about the apartment. She just wanted to understand why she was given something that felt more like punishment than blessing. She dug through a box of old photos that Evelyn had given her years ago. In one, Nia sat on a porch swing, her legs too short to reach the ground, wearing braids and a yellow dress. Her grandmother sat beside her, looking not yet old, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes distant. On the back, in fading pen, it read, Harperville, Summer 96. The next morning, Nia stuffed a few changes of clothes into a duffel bag, took the manila envelope with the keys, and called the bus station. She booked a one-way ticket to Harperville, no plan, no return date. When, she told no one. The Greyhound ride took 6 hours, with 2 transfers and a stop in a town that had more boarded windows than open ones. She stared out the window most of the way, watching the city give way to pine trees, then to fields, then to nothing but sky. It was late afternoon when she stepped off the bus into a sun-bleached town square with no taxis, no welcome signs. Just cracked sidewalks, a post office that looked like it hadn't opened in years, and a general store with a faded cash-only sign taped to the window. She pulled out the folded map. According to the notes, the house was 3 miles up County Route 17, past an old mill and a church. No rideshare apps worked, no bars on her phone. She started walking. The road was hot and quiet. Dust rose with every step. Trees leaned over the gravel, their shadows long. Her legs ached. Her thoughts raced. What would she find? A shack? Ruins? Had Evelyn sent her here to test her? Or exile her? Finally, after a bend in the road and a stretch of rusting fence, she saw it. The house stood at the end of a long gravel drive, surrounded by an overgrown yard and flanked by what had once been a barn. Its paint had long since peeled away, exposing gray wood weathered by time and storms. The windows were shut tight. One shutter hung askew. Vines crawled up the side like veins. She stood at the gate, breath catching. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't welcoming, but it was hers. Nia stepped forward and unlocked the rusted gate. The hinges creaked like a protest. The path was nearly swallowed by tall grass. Weeds brushed her legs. Her shoes sank slightly into the damp earth. As she climbed the steps to the front porch, the boards groaned under her weight. She paused, hand on the door. For a moment, the world seemed to still. A breeze passed through the trees, and something about the silence felt not empty, but expectant, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting. She turned the key and pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with dust and something older, not quite rot, not quite mildew, the scent of time itself. The foyer was dark, lit only by what little sunlight filtered through grimy windows. A hallway stretched ahead, with doorways opening left and right. Cobwebs hung like drapes. The wallpaper was faded and curling at the edges, but the space was intact. No mold, no holes in the walls. Furniture was covered in white sheets, as if someone had planned to return. She stepped further in, her footsteps muffled by old rugs. In the parlor, she lifted a sheet from a couch. Beneath it, the fabric was floral, worn but clean. On the mantel sat a clock that had long since stopped ticking, its hands frozen at 12:17. In the corner, an old photo album rested on a table, as if recently placed. She opened it. The first picture was of Evelyn, young, standing in front of the very house Nia now stood in. She felt the tears before she realized they had started. They welled up hot, then spilled, and she let them. Not just for the house, for the weight of expectation, for the loneliness, for not being chosen, but being sent. Yet here she was, not in the apartment in Atlanta, not in her classroom, not beside Marcus and his apartment keys, here, in Harperville. And something deep within her, something quiet and ancient, stirred awake. Morning broke slowly in Harperville. Mist hovered low over the fields, clinging to the grass like a second skin, as the sun fought to rise through the veil of cloud that stretched across the pale sky. Nia Jackson stood on the front porch of the old house, clutching a chipped mug of weak coffee she had managed to brew using a battered kettle and an old hot plate she found in the pantry. The taste was thin, bitter, but warm, and the warmth was all that mattered now. She wrapped her sweater tighter around her and looked out across the yard, trying to piece together how she had come to this moment. The house still loomed around her, silent and vast. Last night she had made up a bed on a living room couch using some old quilts she found in a cedar chest. The house creaked and groaned all night, as if it were remembering her, reacquainting itself with her presence. She hadn't slept deeply, but she had slept, and in the morning light the shadows seemed a little softer, the house a little less forbidding. Still, the unease lingered. She was a stranger here, in a house that technically belonged to her, yet felt like it belonged more to memory than to the present. The town, or what was left of it, had barely stirred when she stepped off the porch and began the slow walk down the gravel drive. She wanted to see Harperville for herself, see what still existed beyond the gate, beyond the map Evelyn had tucked into the will folder. The walk into town was quiet except for the occasional bird call or rustle in the underbrush. Trees lined both sides of the narrow road, their branches arching overhead in a way that made the path feel enclosed, like a tunnel of time. When she reached what passed for the town center, she found a cluster of faded buildings. The general store with its creaking sign and shuttered windows. A gas station with two pumps that looked like they hadn't worked in years. A church with chipped white paint and a leaning steeple. A post office, barely functional, and a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Open," though it gave off little enthusiasm. The people she passed didn't greet her, but they watched. A few peered through windows. One elderly man sitting on a bench outside the feed store nodded once, but said nothing. Inside the diner, the scent of burnt coffee and bacon hung in the air. Nia sat at the counter and ordered toast and eggs from a young waitress who didn't bother to hide her curiosity. She asked where Nia was from, and when she said Atlanta, the girl raised her eyebrows like she'd named a foreign country. The food was simple but hot. Nia thanked her, paid in cash, and stepped outside into the brightening day with more questions than answers. Back at the house, she set to work exploring. The structure was larger than she remembered. Each room held layers of time. The upstairs bedrooms were full of old trunks, yellowed linens, forgotten toys, and photographs in dusty frames. In one room, she found a rocking chair beside a window that faced east. She sat in it for a long time, listening to the wind against the siding, feeling the chair's gentle rhythm beneath her. She made a list in her notebook. Windows to be repaired, pipes to inspect, leaks in the roof, electrical rewiring. The list grew quickly. More than anything, the place needed care. Not just repairs, but attention, reverence, love. She didn't have the money for contractors, and she didn't even know yet if she was staying. She hadn't decided. That night, after reheating the last of the diner's toast, she sat by the fireplace in the parlor, nursing a sore back and trying to get warm. The house was drafty. The heating didn't work. She wrapped herself in 2 blankets and stared at the flames dancing behind the glass. She tried to imagine Evelyn sitting here years ago, reading or sewing, perhaps humming to herself. She tried to remember the voice that used to sing lullabies on hot summer nights when the box fan buzzed in the window and the moonlight made lace patterns on the ceiling. She drifted off in the chair and woke in the middle of the night with a start. Something had moved. A sound, not quite loud but distinct, echoed from upstairs. A creak, then silence. She waited, heart pounding, then forced herself to stand. Armed with a flashlight and a broom handle, she climbed the stairs slowly, her socked feet making soft scuffing sounds on the worn wood. The hallway was quiet. Nothing stirred. But in the guest room, the one with the rocking chair, the air felt different, as if something had shifted slightly in the atmosphere, like a curtain had been drawn open somewhere she couldn't see. She backed out of the room, closed the door gently, and returned downstairs. The next morning brought sun and a soft breeze. Determined to make sense of the house, Nia began clearing out the attic. She dragged down boxes of clothes, books, magazines, all carefully labeled in Evelyn's neat script. One of the boxes contained letters tied with ribbon, addressed to names Nia didn't recognize, women mostly, some with last names matching Evelyn's maiden name. Holloway. Some of the letters were decades old, dated from the 1940s and 50s. Most were written in flowing cursive on lined paper, with flourishes and formal closings. Nia read a few, feeling like a trespasser in her own history. Later that afternoon, she returned to the master bedroom, drawn by a faint memory. There, behind the old wardrobe, she noticed a small gap in the wall. Not an open door, not even a proper crack, just a subtle unevenness in the paneling. She pressed her fingers against it. Nothing moved. She retrieved a screwdriver from the hallway closet and pried at the seam. With a groan, the panel gave way, revealing a shallow closet filled with dust and shadows. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, was a folded paper map, or what looked like one. The lines were faded but visible, a rough sketch of the house and its surroundings. One section of the drawing was circled, labeled in Evelyn's handwriting, L. Nia frowned. It wasn't a typical room on the floor plan. In fact, it seemed to be somewhere between the pantry and the back hallway, an area she hadn't thought to examine closely. She followed the layout carefully, retracing the map's path through the house. At the end of the hallway, behind a bookshelf that looked bolted in place, she noticed a small draft. Cool air whispered through the seam where the wood didn't quite meet the wall. Her hands trembling, she tugged on the shelf. It didn't budge, but when she pressed the lower left corner, something clicked. The shelf shifted slightly, revealing a narrow, dark doorway. She stepped back, heart pounding. The air behind the shelf was cooler, dry, heavy with silence. She retrieved a flashlight and shone it into the opening. Wooden stairs led down into what looked like a hidden basement or crawl space. She hesitated only a moment before descending. The steps creaked beneath her weight. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, each packed tightly with books. Leather-bound tomes, fragile paperbacks, handmade journals, government pamphlets, cloth-covered volumes with gold foil titles. Dust floated in the flashlight beam like tiny ghosts. The air smelled of old pages and cedar. In the center of the room sat a low wooden table. On it, a brass oil lamp and an open book faced outward, as if someone had just been reading and stepped away. Nia approached slowly. The page was in cursive script, a diary entry dated 1932. The author's name was Ruth Holloway, Evelyn's mother. Nia sank into a stool, overwhelmed. The map had led her to something much more than a secret room. It was a library, a hidden archive, a place of memory and legacy untouched by time. She began to run her fingers along the spines, reading titles, some familiar, some unknown. One was a medical textbook from the 19th century, annotated in the margins with notes in a woman's hand. Another was a collection of folk remedies written in both English and Gula. There were books in French, Spanish, and even one in Latin. Her fingers tingled as if the pages were alive with energy. This place had been kept secret for a reason. That night, sitting in the center of the hidden room, surrounded by knowledge and voices of women she had never met, Nia wept again. But this time not from grief, nor fear, nor exhaustion. She wept because something had shifted inside her. She was not an exile. She was a chosen keeper. The days that followed unfolded with a peculiar rhythm. Mornings began early, not because of alarm clocks or schedules, but because Nia's body seemed to attune itself to the quiet demands of the land and house. The air would still be cool when she woke, the sun just beginning to push through the gauzy curtains of the guest bedroom she'd made her own. Each day, she would make coffee on the old hot plate, drink it while walking barefoot across the creaking floorboards, and take in the house not as a visitor anymore, but as its sole living heartbeat. After discovering the hidden library, something inside her had shifted. The quiet despair that had followed her from Atlanta, a shadow cast by betrayal and loss, had not disappeared, but it had receded, dulled by awe and a strange sort of purpose. She had not yet read even a fraction of the texts lining the walls of that secret room. Each time she descended into it, flashlight or oil lamp in hand, she felt as though she were stepping into sacred ground. She had spent an entire afternoon cataloging just one shelf. Old anatomy books, a handwritten ledger listing names, dates, and midwifery notations, and several pamphlets with political commentary from black women in the 1930s and 40s. Many of the books bore signatures, sometimes initials, sometimes full names. One name appeared again and again: Ruth Holloway, her great-grandmother. There were annotations and margins, often written in elegant cursive, underlined phrases, even pressed flowers between pages. Nia read through these artifacts with trembling fingers, not rushing, unwilling to treat them as mere objects. The room was cool and dry, preserved by its concealment. The lack of windows had kept the elements at bay, and the books, despite their age, showed only the most minor wear. A small ventilation shaft ran along the ceiling, which must have allowed just enough airflow. Someone, Evelyn, she presumed, had taken great care to protect this room. The presence of a dehumidifier in the corner, long unplugged, confirmed it. This was no accident. This was a shrine. On the third morning after the discovery, Nia found a new thread to follow. Behind a row of leather-bound journals, she unearthed a worn wooden box no larger than a shoebox. Inside, bundled in linen, were glass bottles with handwritten labels, bundles of dried herbs tied with red thread, and a small bound book with the words "Remedies and Receipts" etched into the cover. The first page was dated 1887. The script was delicate, almost fragile in its precision. The contents ranged from fever cures and birthing instructions to prayers, charms, and protective rituals. A blend of medicine, spirituality, and cultural memory passed through generations. Nia turned the pages slowly, her breath catching as she read notes written in the margins by different hands, some correcting recipes, others adding warnings or testimonies of their success. One note read, "Used on Ms. Johnson's baby in summer of '94. Fever broke by morning." Another simply said, "Mama's remedy never failed." She was touching the lives of women who had lived through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, segregation, wars, and countless unnamed struggles. And they had documented what they knew in a language of survival. Nia felt both unworthy and fiercely protective. That evening, she sat on the floor of the library and read aloud one of Ruth Holloway's diary entries. The words described delivering a child during a lightning storm with only kerosene light and boiling water. The mother had been just 15, terrified and alone, her own mother having died the year before. Ruth's account was not clinical. It was raw, honest, and compassionate. She wrote of holding the girl's hand, of whispering prayers, of wiping her brow, of the baby's first cry breaking through the thunder. Nia read the words aloud with reverence, her voice trembling. When she finished, she closed the book and pressed it to her chest, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She did not know yet what to do with all this knowledge, but she knew it could not remain hidden. Later that night, she explored more of the house. Guided by the map she had found, she examined the rest of the property more thoroughly. She discovered an exterior entrance to the basement, padlocked, but the key labeled "cellar" was still in the envelope Evelyn had left her. The cellar door groaned when she opened it, revealing a wide, dry space with shelves of canned food, tools, and what looked like medical supplies from a bygone era. On one of the shelves, beneath a tarp, sat an old safe. Heavy, metal, and ornate, it had no keyhole, only a brass combination dial. Nia stared at the safe, heart pounding. She didn't know the code. She didn't even know what could be inside. Her fingers hovered over the dial before she turned away, deciding she needed to think. That night, curled up beneath Evelyn's patchwork quilt, she lay awake thinking of the safe. Evelyn had always been meticulous with birthdays. Every year, without fail, Nia had received a handwritten card. Even during the hardest seasons, even when her brother forgot, even when her own father failed to call, Evelyn had remembered. It had been one of her most consistent acts of love. A thought stirred. In the morning, with a nervous energy, Nia returned to the basement. She knelt before the safe and slowly, methodically, turned the dial to her own birth date, month, day, and year. When she reached the final number, she hesitated, hand trembling, then pulled the handle. A soft click. Then the heavy door swung open. Inside, she found envelopes tied with ribbon, photo albums wrapped in cloth, and folders full of documents arranged with Evelyn's familiar precision. At the top lay a sealed envelope with her name on it. She opened it with unsteady fingers. Evelyn's handwriting greeted her in the familiar tilt of long-inked letters. "My dearest Nia," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you have found your way back to the beginning. I know it may not have looked like a gift at first. I know what Marcus received seemed more useful, more comfortable. But I had to make a choice that honored not what you wanted, but who you are. I chose you to carry this." The letter was long. In it, Evelyn explained the history of the house, the library, and the women who had come before. She spoke of Ruth and the generations of healers and midwives who had lived and worked in Harperville. She explained that Marcus had never shown interest in legacy, only in legacy's profits. But Nia, she had always listened. As a child, she had asked questions. She had remembered stories. She had looked at things not for what they were, but for what they meant. "There is power in remembering," Evelyn wrote, "and there is danger in forgetting." The next few days were a blur of discovery and reflection. Nia spent her mornings sorting the documents in the safe, her afternoons reading the library's volumes, and her evenings journaling her own thoughts. Each hour deepened her understanding. The house, once a crumbling burden, now pulsed with meaning. It held the echoes of women who had lived with purpose and strength, often in silence. One afternoon, while digging through an old trunk beneath the stairs, she found a photograph that nearly stopped her breath. It showed Evelyn, as a young woman, standing beside another woman in a starched white uniform. Behind them, the house. They were smiling, but the smiles were serious, dignified. On the back, Evelyn had written, "Ruth and me, the last summer before we locked the room." It was the confirmation she had needed. The room had been hidden, yes, but not forgotten. It had been protected, preserved. That night, Nia took the photograph, the diary, and the herb book and sat outside on the porch under a wide blanket of stars. The air smelled of earth and old wood, and the sounds of the country surrounded her. Crickets, distant owls, the occasional bark of a dog far away. She stared up at the sky and felt, for the first time in years, not lost, but located. She was no longer an outsider to this place. She was its continuation. The house no longer whispered doubts. It hummed with affirmation. She had found the room hidden in time, but it was more than a room. It was a mirror, a vessel, a calling, and she was ready to answer it. The morning after she sat beneath the stars, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No earthquake in her heart, no prophetic dreams, just the familiar weight of the house settling around her in a way that felt heavier than usual. The hidden room, the journals, the letters, each revelation had drawn her in, wrapping her in invisible threads that connected her to women long gone. But now those threads began to feel like cords wrapped tight around her chest. There was so much to carry, so much to understand, and she didn't know if she could. The air in the house was cold. The heater still didn't work. The plumbing had begun to groan in a way that made her stomach twist, and the roof over the upstairs hallway leaked steadily into a rusty pan she'd placed to catch the drips. The house, full of secrets and stories, was also a crumbling shell, demanding more from her than she had to give. The pantry was nearly empty. Her bank account, which had never been flush, now blinked with warning colors on her phone. There was no income. No paycheck coming in 2 weeks. No job. No insurance. Her car was still back in Atlanta, dead in a parking lot, the repairs too expensive to justify. She had taken a one-way bus to Harperville, full of desperation and instinct. But instinct didn't patch roofs. It didn't put food on the table or keep the lights on. She stood in the kitchen, her fingers trembling as she counted out the last few dollars in her wallet. There might be enough for bread and a carton of eggs if the corner store was still open and still took cash. Maybe. But after that, she didn't know. She didn't even have enough gas or battery to charge her phone more than once a day. The charging cable had begun to fray, sparking when she plugged it in. It felt like every corner of her life was unraveling at once. The knock came in the middle of this quiet storm, sharp, confident, not the hesitant tap of a neighbor. She froze, unsure whether to answer, but then a voice called out through the door, too familiar to ignore. "Nia, open up!" Marcus. She opened the door to find her brother standing on the porch, wearing sunglasses, jeans that looked like they cost more than her entire outfit, and that insufferable smirk. He held a coffee in one hand and a phone in the other, which he slipped into his coat pocket as he stepped past her without waiting for an invitation. "Still no electricity? Damn, Nia, you really went full Walden Pond out here." He chuckled, shaking his head as he looked around. "What are you doing here?" she asked quietly. He walked through the parlor as if inspecting an exhibit, lifting the edge of a sheet that still covered the upright piano. "Just checking in. Thought maybe you'd come to your senses." She folded her arms. "What's that supposed to mean?" He turned to her with mock innocence. "I mean, come on. You've been here, 3 weeks? This place is falling apart. I'm guessing you haven't found a job out here in the booming Harperville economy. You can't keep this up." She said nothing. "I figured I'd save you some trouble," he continued, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a folded document and handed it to her. "I had a new agreement drawn up. I'll take this off your hands. You get a payout, and maybe a slice of the apartment income. Rental's already under contract." She unfolded the paper. Legal jargon, a buyout clause, an offer of $10,000. Her fingers clenched around it. "You're trying to buy me out." "I'm trying to help you," he said, suddenly serious. "This place is dead weight, Nia. Grandma left it because she knew it wasn't worth fighting over. She gave me the only property that's worth anything. That doesn't make her cruel. It makes her practical. You're here alone, broke, chasing ghosts. What's the point?" She looked at him, really looked at him. For all his polish and ease, there was something behind his eyes that looked less like confidence and more like calculation. She thought of the library, the journals, the safe, the decades of stories and sacrifice buried in the walls he now called worthless. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're not serious." "I am. You're broke. Living in a house with a leaking roof and no heating. Don't tell me this place is more valuable than 10 grand in your account." "I'm not telling you anything," she said, handing him the paperback, "but I'm not selling." He stood there for a moment, staring at her. Then he laughed, low and bitter. "Fine. Be stubborn. Just don't come crawling to me when the tax bill shows up or the roof collapses on your head." And then he was gone. The door slammed behind him like a verdict. That night, Nia sat at the kitchen table, the silence so deep it seemed to buzz. Her flashlight flickered beside her, the batteries running low. The only sound was the ticking of the clock that no longer worked, its hands frozen but still somehow marking time. She felt it then, the crushing weight of it all. The house, the memories, the silence, the stories she hadn't finished reading, the letters she hadn't answered. Her shoulders slumped forward and her head dropped into her hands. The tears came, slow and hot, sliding down her face and dripping onto the table. She didn't wipe them away. Let them come, she thought. Let them wash it all out. She wept for the exhaustion, the helplessness, the bitterness she'd carried for years. For every time she'd been told she was too soft, too quiet, too unremarkable to be anything. For the way Marcus had always made her feel like a shadow in her own life. For the grandmother who had chosen her but hadn't stayed long enough to explain why. She cried until the room blurred and the weight in her chest became unbearable. And then, just as suddenly, it broke. She stood up, hands clenched. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were dry now. She walked into the parlor where the old fireplace stood unused, covered in soot. She dragged the iron poker from its cradle and began to clear it out. Dust flew into the air, ash settled on her clothes, and still she worked. She cleaned until the hearth gleamed. Then she lit a fire. The warmth began to spread slowly, gently pushing back the cold. She sat down on the floor in front of it, wrapped in Evelyn's quilt, and stared into the flames. In her lap lay one of Ruth's journals, the page marked with a slip of dried magnolia petal. "I will not be afraid," the entry read. "I will not run. My mother's voice lives in these walls." Nia read the sentence again and again until it was no longer Ruth's voice but her own. She rose the next morning with a clarity she had not felt in weeks. The first rays of sunlight glowed through the curtains as if affirming something unspoken. She bathed in a basin of warm water she'd heated herself, changed into clean clothes, and brushed her hair until it lay smooth over her shoulders. Then she pulled out a clean notebook and began to write. Not Evelyn's story, or Ruth's, or any of the other women whose voices had filled the house. She began her own. She wrote of the day she arrived, the way the house looked, the sound of the wind through the broken shutters, the fear, the confusion, the discovery. She wrote about the hidden room, the first journal she opened, the words that had anchored her when everything else fell apart. She didn't know what the end of the story would be, but she knew how it began. It began with staying. That afternoon, she walked to the edge of the property where the fence had collapsed beneath the weight of years. She found an old shovel in the barn, cleared away the overgrowth, and began to dig post holes. She didn't know how to build a fence, but she would learn. She would do it one post at a time, and in that small act of rebuilding, she began to mend something much deeper. She had come close to breaking. So close she had felt the splinters begin to rise. But she had not broken. And she would not. She had decided she was staying. The days after her decision passed differently. It was as if the act of choosing to stay had altered not only Nia's resolve, but the very rhythm of her world. She moved through the house with a new sense of ownership, not just as a physical space, but as something inherited, sacred, and deeply alive. The stillness that had once felt suffocating now wrapped around her like a waiting silence, not empty, but listening. Her mornings began with purpose, even if the work ahead was daunting. Each creaking board she stepped over reminded her that this place had stood for generations, and now it stood for her. The first task she tackled was the roof. She had never repaired anything more complicated than a leaky faucet, but she knew the upstairs hallway wouldn't survive another rainstorm. With a borrowed ladder, a roll of tarp, and a toolkit she found in the shed, she climbed onto the slope one overcast morning and began patching the worst of the damage. It was dangerous work, and her hands blistered quickly, but there was something empowering in the ache. It wasn't just shingles she was repairing, it was history. That same afternoon, she walked into town to the general store, hoping to find replacement bulbs and nails. Inside, the smell of dust and old wood mixed with the faint tang of citrus cleaner. A middle-aged man behind the counter, bald with a salt and pepper beard, glanced up from a small radio playing soft blues. He watched her approach without saying a word. Nia offered a cautious smile and explained what she needed. He didn't respond immediately. Then he set his newspaper aside and motioned toward the back. Third aisle, left side, nails are top shelf, bulbs 2 rows down, he said, his voice deep and dry as cracked earth. She gathered what she could afford and returned to the counter. He rang her up without small talk but paused before taking her cash. "You're the Jackson girl?" he asked. Nia hesitated. "I'm Nia, Evelyn Jackson's granddaughter." He nodded once. "I remember your grandmother. She used to come in every month, bought peppermints and cat food, wore a green coat in the summer like she didn't notice heat. Strong woman." Nia smiled faintly. "She was." "You livin' in the old place?" he asked. "For now," she said. He didn't say anything more, but he slipped an extra pack of nails into her bag and nodded toward the door. "You let me know if you need anything." Word spread faster than she anticipated. The next morning, she found a basket of vegetables sitting on her porch. Tomatoes, okra, sweet potatoes, topped with a note that simply read, "For Miss Jackson's girl. R." The handwriting was small, lupin, careful. That evening, someone left a bundle of firewood beside the steps. Then a package of fresh eggs appeared. At first, Nia felt unnerved. Who were these people? Why were they watching her? But slowly, a different understanding settled over her. This wasn't surveillance. This was welcome, even if it came wordlessly. A few days later, as she was pulling weeds along the overgrown garden fence, an elderly woman appeared at the gate, her cane tapping against the gravel. She wore a wide straw hat and a faded blue dress. Her skin was the color of cedar bark, soft and lined from age and sun. Nia stood up and brushed dirt from her hands. "You must be Miss R," Nia said, smiling. The woman chuckled. "I suppose I am, though most folk round here just call me Agatha." She looked Nia over with a knowing squint. "Your grandma and I used to sit on that porch and argue over pie crusts. I told her lard made it flakier. She swore by butter and pride." Nia laughed softly. "Sounds like her." Agatha stepped closer. "I heard what you're trying to do here. That house's bones are good, but it needs hands. You got hands?" "I'm trying," Nia said honestly. Agatha nodded, satisfied. "Then you need yon. Man's got golden hands. Lives over near Old Mill Road. Bit odd, but he treats old things with soul." She handed Nia a slip of paper with a number scribbled in pencil. "Call him. Tell him Aggie sent you." Nia wasn't sure what she expected when she dialed the number from a borrowed landline at the post office. The man who answered didn't say hello, just grunted. She introduced herself, explained what she needed, and mentioned Agatha's name. There was a long silence. "You got money?" he finally asked. "Not much," she admitted. "Enough for materials?" "Barely. I'll be there tomorrow, 8 a.m. True to his word, Jan arrived in a battered truck the next morning. He was a tall man, probably in his late 60s, with a heavy beard and calloused hands. He wore overalls and boots caked in dried mud. He didn't speak much, just walked the perimeter of the house, climbed onto the roof, checked the siding, tested the floors. After an hour of inspection, he returned to the porch and sat down heavily in the old rocking chair Evelyn used to favor. "It's bad," he said plainly, "but not hopeless." "What's the worst of it?" Nia asked, notebook in hand. "Roof, foundation, porch supports, plumbing's halfway gone, wiring's mostly shot, but the frame's strong. It was built to last." They worked out a timeline and a modest payment plan. He would come twice a week, and Nia would help where she could. He promised to teach her what he knew. "You got to learn to take care of it yourself," he said. "A house like this don't respond to strangers." As the repairs began, Nia saw the house come alive piece by piece. The creaking porch steps were reinforced, shingles were replaced, broken panes swapped for new glass. Jan didn't just repair, he restored, treating the house as something to be respected, not conquered. Meanwhile, Nia turned her attention back to the library. The more she read, the clearer it became that the collection was not just rare, it was extraordinary. There were first editions of Black women writers from the Harlem Renaissance, medical texts from Black midwives during the Reconstruction era, letters exchanged between abolitionists and educators. She didn't have the expertise to assess value, but she could feel the weight of what she held. She took photographs of several volumes and sent them to a handful of rare book dealers in Atlanta. Only one responded with interest. A woman named Dr. Kiernan from an antique bookstore specializing in the Southern Black literature and historical archives. After a brief call, Dr. Kiernan offered to send a colleague to examine the collection in person. 2 days later, a young man named Carell arrived in a green sedan. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, a tweed jacket, and carried a small leather case. He introduced himself with quiet confidence and followed Nia into the hidden room. As he stepped inside, he gasped audibly. "This," he said, eyes wide behind his lenses, "this is a treasure trove." He moved from shelf to shelf like a pilgrim in a sacred temple, reverently touching the spines, flipping open pages, murmuring to himself. Nia watched as he carefully cataloged items in his notebook, occasionally asking questions about the home's history. "You know what you have here?" he asked finally. "I'm beginning to," Nia said. "Some of these books are so rare they don't exist in any public collection. This," he held up a slim volume, "is a private printing from 1902. Only 20 copies were made. This could be worth more than a 3-bedroom apartment in Atlanta." Nia's breath caught. "One book?" He nodded. "One. And you have dozens, possibly more. Some of these are culturally priceless." Carell offered to help connect her with academic institutions and collectors, but Nia hesitated. She wasn't ready to let go. She needed time to understand what she held, not just in value, but in meaning. That evening, overwhelmed, she sat by the fire with a cup of tea. The house around her no longer felt like it was collapsing. It felt like it was awakening. Agatha had returned that afternoon with jars of canned peaches and gossip about Jan's 3 ex-wives. Carell had promised to email her a full preliminary report. Jan had finished repairing the foundation under the library wing and declared it sound. And Nabaya had begun writing again. Not just notes or journal entries, but something larger. A story. Maybe even a book. In that moment, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The house, the land, the people, they were beginning to claim her, just as she was claiming them. And for the first time, she welcomed it. Autumn had begun to press gently against the edges of Harperville. The leaves on the sycamores turned slow shades of gold and rust, and the morning air held a crispness that made Nia breathe deeper. The house, now steadily transforming under Jan's diligent repairs and her own calloused hands, no longer looked like it had one foot in the grave. The porch was solid, the windows gleamed, the roof held firm. She could walk across the upstairs hall without holding her breath. The house, like her, had survived its quiet collapse and found reason to rise again. But it wasn't just the structure that had been unearthed. As she organized and cataloged more of the library's contents, she found herself at the center of a story far bigger than she'd ever imagined. The hidden room had become a space of ritual, a place where she spent hours each day reading, transcribing, cross-referencing. Carell had kept his word, returning a week later with his preliminary report, a stack of typed notes in a folder labeled The Jackson Holloway Collection. He explained that several university libraries and private collectors had already expressed interest, though he emphasized that the cultural and historical value likely outweighed any market offer. But Nia wasn't thinking about selling. What she wanted was to understand. One cool afternoon, as she flipped through a worn notebook bound in faded red cloth, she found a single line that froze her breath. This house served the railroad. The words were underlined twice. The ink bled faintly into the fibers. She read the sentence again and again, heart thudding. She flipped back through the preceding pages, this time more carefully. The handwriting was Ruth's, her great-grandmother, but these entries were different from the midwifery logs and medical notes Nia had come to know. These pages were marked with coded names, dates, vague references to deliveries and late-night preparations, and phrases that at first glance seemed innocuous, but Nia knew enough history now to recognize them for what they were. The Underground Railroad. She stood from the small stool, heart racing. Her mind reeled. The library hadn't just been a sanctuary of knowledge. It had been a place of resistance. The house, with its false walls, its cellar, its secluded position miles from any main road, none of it was accidental. In a near trance, she made her way back to the basement, flashlight in hand. The air down there was cool and dry as always, but the shadows seemed to thicken. She approached the wall opposite the safe, where wooden shelves held forgotten tools and dusty paint cans. One shelf, she now realized, looked newer than the others, its wood less cracked, its screws not rusted. She crouched and pressed her hands along the edges. Click. A panel gave slightly under her touch. Her breath caught. She pulled it open, revealing a narrow crawl space no wider than a coat closet. Inside, the floor was dirt. The walls were brick. And in one corner sat a small cot, folded wool blanket, and a rusted lantern. There was a dented tin cup and a single shoe, child-sized. Nia backed away slowly, knees weak, eyes burning. This house had held people, hidden them, protected them. Her family, her blood, had risked everything to defy the laws of their time, not in loud marches or headlines, but in the quiet courage of sanctuary. She felt herself sink to the floor, breath shallow. For a long time she sat there, trying to absorb the truth. That night, she called Carell. He listened in silence as she described what she had found. When she finished, his voice was reverent. "Nia, this is beyond rare. It's monumental. You have physical evidence of a safe house. It may be the only site of its kind in this part of the state that still exists intact." She stared out the window, the stars cool and distant. "I want it preserved. Not sold, not boxed up and taken away. I want it remembered." "You'll need official recognition," he said. "Historical designation, legal protection. I can connect you with people who do that." "Do it," she said. The following weeks became a flurry of research and contact with preservation experts. A historian from the state university came to inspect the property, taking measurements and photographs, speaking with Nia for hours about what she had uncovered. The story gained attention slowly. first in local academic circles, then through a university press release. The first time a journalist called her, she almost didn't answer. But when she did, her words came easily. "This was never just a house," she said. "It was a witness." Soon after, Nia decided to track down Uncle Petey, the son of Evelyn's childhood friend, whom she had read about in one of the letters from the safe. The address book had listed a number in Alabama. She called it on a warm Sunday morning. The voice on the other end was cracked and wheezy with age, but unmistakably delighted to hear her. "Evelyn's little Nia," he said, coughing a laugh. "Lord, I never thought I'd hear that name again." They spoke for an hour. Uncle Petey remembered the house, remembered Ruth, remembered the days when the town was tighter, when people whispered secrets in kitchens and passed news through hymns at church. He remembered Evelyn's warnings never to talk about the library or the cellar. He remembered men coming in the middle of the night and leaving before dawn. "You holding on to something mighty precious," he said. "Your grandma used to say, we don't leave stones unturned. We guard what's buried till the world's ready." "I think the world might be ready now," Nia replied. "Then open the doors, baby. Just don't forget who kept them closed for so long." When she hung up, Nia cried again, not from sorrow, but from the sheer weight of gratitude. Carell returned with a small film crew from the university, shooting a preliminary documentary for the Historical Commission. Nia led them through the library, the hidden room, the crawl space. She spoke on camera about the women whose hands had written the journals, mixed the herbs, lit the lamps for strangers in the dark. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. That same week, she began the paperwork for forming a nonprofit foundation. She called it the House of Memory. Its mission, to preserve, educate, and empower. The community responded in a way she hadn't dared to hope. Locals volunteered to help clean the grounds. A retired teacher offered to help develop a curriculum. A former pastor offered to host a fundraiser. Agatha arrived with a crock pot of gumbo and declared herself treasurer, whether Nia liked it or not. And when the first school group arrived, a van of seventh-grade girls from Atlanta, Nia stood at the threshold of the library and felt her throat close with emotion. She welcomed them in. She told them stories. She passed around copies of pages handwritten by women who looked like them. She showed them the little crawl space and told them about a time when silence was resistance and kindness was dangerous. One girl, wide-eyed and awestruck, looked up and asked, "They were heroes, weren't they?" Nia smiled. "Yes, they were." The following night, Marcus called again. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. "I saw the news," he said without preamble. "You made the paper. Something about a hidden archive and a historic site. I didn't realize. All that was in the house." Nia said nothing. "I just wanted to say, maybe you were right to stay." She leaned back in her chair, looking out at the glowing porch light, the freshly painted boards beneath her bare feet. "I didn't stay because I was right," she said. "I stayed because I belonged." There was a long silence on the line. Then Marcus spoke, quieter than before. "Well, if you ever need anything, you know how to reach me." "Thanks, Marcus," she said, not out of bitterness, but because she meant it. She hung up and walked out into the yard, where the wind danced through the trees. The stars overhead pulsed gently. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted once. Inside, the fireplace crackled. On the mantel sat a new photo. Nia surrounded by the first group of visiting girls, smiling wide, her hand resting on the shoulder of a girl with glasses and braids who reminded her of herself. She sat on the edge of the rocking chair Evelyn had once used and opened Ruth's journal to a page she hadn't yet read. I hope one day someone finds this, it said, and when they do, I hope they listen. Nia smiled. She was listening. 1 year later, the house stood different, not only in structure but in spirit. The walls were no longer weighed down by silence but lifted by voices, stories, and the rhythmic movement of footsteps that had returned. The roof no longer groaned under neglect. It sheltered life. The garden, once swallowed by weeds, now pulsed with rows of green herbs, flowering bushes, and the soft hum of bees. Where there had once been decay, there was now breath. The house no longer waited. It lived. Nia Jackson stood at the edge of the porch in the late morning sun, watching a group of teenage girls cross the front yard with clipboards in hand, their laughter rising like birdsong. They were participants in the House of Memories fall program, young scholars from public schools across the state, here to study the personal archives of Black Southern women, led not by textbooks, but by the women's own preserved words. For most of the girls, it was their first trip beyond the city. For all of them, it was the first time they'd been in a place where their histories took center stage. The sight made Nia's heart swell with quiet pride. She walked inside through the newly restored double doors, their hinges oiled, their handles polished. The parlor had been transformed into a welcoming room. Bookshelves lined one wall, photographs of Ruth, Evelyn, and other women from the archives framed in delicate wood. A table held a guest book and a basket of hand-stitched bookmarks made by the girls in the program. The scent of lemon balm and old paper drifted gently from the back hallway, where the library now opened with no need for secrecy. Carell had returned several times throughout the year, working with Nia and a small team of graduate students to digitally archive every document and book in the collection. A climate-controlled glass enclosure had been installed in the secret room, now dubbed the Holloway Archive, funded through donations and grants. The books that could be preserved in situ remained, cataloged and lovingly maintained. Others, too fragile to stay, had been stored in acid-free boxes and rotated with care. Every decision had been made with intention, and every addition to the house had passed through Nia's hands. She refused to let the legacy be extracted and relocated. The land had held this memory for a reason, and she had promised herself and the women before her to honor that. As she moved through the kitchen, now bright with sunlight and painted a soft cream, she caught sight of the garden from the back window. A group of volunteers was planting winter greens while Agatha, now the unofficial grandmother of the center, supervised from a chair near the shed. Jon walked alongside them, his gait slower but sure, his hat shading his lined face. He still came twice a week, even when he had nothing left to fix, just to walk the perimeter and make sure the house still stood proud, as he put it. The kitchen wall now bore a mural, a painting by a young artist who had visited in the spring. It depicted a tree with wide roots, the branches forming the silhouettes of women reading, nursing, planting, praying. Nia had cried when she first saw it finished, her hand pressed to her mouth as she traced each painted figure. She had grown here. More than that, she had become. It wasn't just that she now ran a foundation or had her name in articles and grants. It wasn't about prestige. It was about a truth so old and deep that it couldn't be taught, only remembered. She had not come to Harperville to escape failure. She had come because she'd been chosen to remember. And now, she knew, remembering was the most radical act of all. That afternoon, a white van pulled up the gravel drive and the girls began lining up near the front steps for their final group session. Nia stepped outside and called them in with a warm wave, her voice sure. Inside the parlor, they gathered on the rug, seated in a circle, their faces bright with curiosity and a little weariness. Nia held a folder in her hands, photocopies of journal entries, photographs, poems, and a final letter written by Evelyn to a young Nia, never sent but found after the last batch of envelopes had been processed. She handed out pages to each girl. These are pieces of stories from women who lived in this house, women who carried their communities on their backs, who wrote letters by oil lamp, stitched bandages by moonlight, and whispered truth when the world refused to listen. One girl, Mariah, raised her hand. Were they scared? Yes, Nia said honestly. They were scared. They were exhausted. They were human. But they acted anyway, sometimes through protest, sometimes through protection, sometimes just by surviving and telling the truth. The girls grew quiet, reading the pages with their own thoughts painted across their faces. Some scribbled notes. Others underlined words with fingers. A few blinked away tears. Nia stepped back and let them take it in. The house hummed with that same stillness it always had. Not silence, but breath. She felt Evelyn behind her, Ruth in the library, the unnamed women who had once slept in the crawlspace or cooked meals in the fireplace. All watching, all present. As the session ended, the girls packed up their things, lingering a little longer than necessary. One girl hugged her before leaving. Another slipped her a folded note. "You made me feel like I mattered," it read. "Thank you." When the van pulled away and the gravel settled back into place, Nia returned inside and stood in the center of the hallway. It was late now, the light golden. The house was quiet again, but it was a living quiet, a breathing pause between moments. She walked upstairs to what had become her study, once the unused guest room. The desk was covered with drafts of a manuscript, her own story, slowly written over the last year. A combination of personal memoir, historical narrative, and reflections on legacy. She didn't know if anyone would publish it. She didn't need them to. She looked out the window, where the garden bent under the breeze, and the old barn glowed faintly in the fading sun. The phone buzzed once. A text from Marcus. "Saw the piece on PBS. Proud of you, sis." She stared at it for a long time before replying. "Thank you." No bitterness, no hesitation, just truth. She shut off the phone and walked downstairs, drawn to the hearth. She lit a fire and sat on the same rug where the girls had sat, tucking her legs beneath her, wrapped in Evelyn's favorite shawl. In her lap, Ruth's journal lay open to a page that had caught her eye earlier. It read simply, "This house has memory, not of grandeur, but of grace." She closed the journal slowly and leaned back against the old rocking chair, now her own. The flames flickered shadows across the walls, dancing around the portraits of the women who had lived and worked and loved within these walls. She thought about the girl she had been when she arrived, exiled, uncertain, called worthless by the only people left who should have held her close. And she thought about the woman she had become, not because the world had given her permission, but because she had listened when the past whispered, because she had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. She smiled, not because the work was finished, it was only just beginning, but because she finally understood what it meant to come home. The house, old and dignified, breathed around her. And so did she. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore the rest of the channel for powerful stories like this one. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it.